Welcome, class, to Lesson 7, Church Leadership, under Biblical Leadership, which is our overall arching theme for this particular series of studies. Looking at our class outline, this is Lesson 7. We have an online on servant leadership. Going to be looking at how we go about putting all this into application in our next one. But right now, what we're going to be concentrating on how this works as a church. One thing to note, this is a re-recording. This lesson was originally given live. Unfortunately, the audio had a problem, so there will be aspects for those of you that were actually there in the class that might be missing when we had some of our discussion. That won't be here because this is, like I said, a re-recording of the lesson. A couple other things to note. Let me just go back to our guess I can't go back. Okay, anyway. We'll just continue on then. What we're going to be looking at here is church leadership. First question, there's several questions that come up. What is the church? What are the goals of the church? And whose church is it? So when we look at what is the church, what does it require to actually be called the church? Or we call it a church. And that's part of the definition we're going to get into here is, what is the church? What are the goals of the church? What is it that a church is supposed to be doing? And whose church is it? Is it the senior pastors? Does it belong to the board of elders? The congregation? Actually, I believe you're all probably going to know the answer to this one right off the bat. Actually belongs to Jesus because he's the one that founded it. He's the head. And we'll get more into detail on that in just a bit. Jesus left us with a commission. First to the apostles and then his disciples, and then to all that follow on. This is familiar to everybody, Matthew 28, 19, and 20. I want to concentrate on just a few of the actions that are in this thing, mostly the verbs. It says, "Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things I have commanded you." Let's go through each of those quickly. Go. It does say go. It doesn't say sit around and wait for people to show up. It says go to where the people are that need to hear the good news. That's what Jesus did. You look at his ministry, he was constantly on the move, going to people that needed him, going to the different areas, whether he's up in Galilee or if he was down in Jerusalem or if he went over into Samaria or into the Decapolis. He was constantly on the move, trying to bring his message to those that needed it, that might not necessarily be the ones that would be showing up on festival days in Jerusalem. He was there for those too, obviously, but he also went out to where the people were. He was out among them. He was out among people that the religious leaders of the day considered people that weren't even worthy talking to. Because as he said, he's there to heal the sick, not the ones that don't need it. Although there was only one on the planet that didn't really need his message, and that was himself. But anyway, next one we'll look at is make. What you're making disciples. It takes time to make an effort to make a disciple. So it's not just go out and say, okay, I've given you the news, now you're a follower and good luck. See you later. You have to be able to spend the time. That's why, as we'll see, the early church spent time after they would be out on their missionary journeys. They'd establish churches, establish leaders, and make sure that there was somebody there to care for all these new believers, to help them grow in their faith, rather than just say, okay, here's the good news, now deal with it the best you can. Baptizing. Okay, you got the ordinances. Are you saved by being baptized? No. But it's a symbol. It's a way to publicly pronounce that, yes, I am a believer. Allows the church to function, as a nurturing body, to be there to support those that are making that commitment, publicly stating it. And just helping them to again, it's their commitment to God and basically the church's commitment to them, saying, okay, you have publicly stated that you are a follower. Now, your job is to learn, and it's our job to help you learn. Which, of course, brings us to the next thing, teaching. Teaching can be done on many levels. It doesn't mean it's just the senior pastor up there teaching a sermon on Sunday. You've got all the teaching functions that any church does. Jesus taught on many levels just within his own ministry. He had his big crowd pronouncements. He had his walking along the way pronouncements with his group of followers. And he had some very intimate one-on-one teaching to those that were the closest to him and the ones that he was going to count on to lead this bunch after he had gone back to heaven. All again part of training, as we've seen, as part of biblical leadership, is to training those who are going to be following on. And in any, as you would say, like typical church today, you've got, the weekend message. You've got Bible studies. You've got Sunday school. So all the Sunday school teachers, they're teaching. There's lots of teaching that goes on as part of being the church. And the last thing we have in here is to observe all things that I have commanded you, which means obey. So part of what we teach them is how to obey, the benefits of obeying, and of course, as leaders, we're super responsible for obeying what God has said about how to lead his church. And one of the things in your textbook is that there's a big discussion about this Matthew 16:18, where it says, I will build my church. He said, that's what Jesus himself said. So I think it's best to take a look at each part of this in a little bit of detail. So we're just going to go through and just hit each word. I, the first one, I. Jesus is the founder and the cornerstone of the church. Starts off, he's saying, me. I'm the one. He selected and trained the first group of leaders. He protects his church. And he gave his life for his church. Next word we look at is will. Obviously that's indicating that something's going to happen in the future. When Jesus initially spoke of the church, it didn't exist. He was essentially still training the first church staff. Or maybe the staff of the first few churches would be a better way at it, because after he departed, a lot of these disciples and the apostles themselves went out on their missionary journeys and were establishing churches everywhere that they traveled. So essentially he was doing the training of the first church staffs. Initially they started off right where they were, but then they spread and they spread, and they kept following his example of training up those that they had in that area. They would gather them together, train them, and then establish them as the church in the area with a leader and the idea of, okay, now you have to train people to help all these new people that are going to be coming once they hear this good news. And it's a continuing process to build the church. Construction started 2,000 years ago, but it's still going on, and it's going to continue until Christ returns. So we're always building the church. Which, of course, brings to the next word, which is build. The church started by Jesus laying down the cornerstone, which was, of course, himself. And he gave the instructions to start a long-term building process. He left the blueprints and a set of instructions and the people trained in how to start the building process. Now we're talking here about building the church, not building the church building, the structure. A church does not need a building in order to be the church. When will the building phase end? Look at Ephesians 4:13. Till we all come to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to a perfect man, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. Basically, when the last person has heard the good news, who God knows is going to accept it, that's when the building phase is ended, because Jesus will come back to claim his church and build from then on in his perfect church. Now we get to my. Again, this is just a reaffirmation that Jesus is the head and the owner of the church. Another verse that emphasizes this, you see at the bottom of your slide here, which is Colossians 1:16 to 18. It says, all things were created through him, referring to Jesus, and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things consist. And he is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in all things he may have preeminence. Now this is one of the places where in the class when this was originally presented, we actually had a discussion. So we're going to have to substitute something here. I'll give you a couple ideas, but something just to contemplate on your own then. Or if you happen to be among some people that are working with this, or you're working with, you might just bring up this subject and have your own discussions. But what happens when church leaders forget whose church it is? You know, we've seen some fairly big name leaders have some falls. You might see some examples of things where church leaders often, think it's more about them than it is about Jesus and his church. You'll find some people that just will not stand to have their, quote, authority questioned. You get some people that are really, really let the title of senior pastor or evangelist or whatever title they've given themselves. A lot of people like to give themselves title of bishop. And I'm not talking about in the formal things like the hierarchical church structures like you have with the Roman Catholics, or even within, say, what I grew up in, a Lutheran, where you have an official title within the church structure called bishop. Some people will just declare themselves as bishop, and they often will have some issues where they feel that title gives them certain privileges and things that you'll never find in the definition of the church. But just think back to maybe some examples you may have seen. This ties in, of course, real well with your essay and your exam that we put out about having to look at various ministries and seeing how their biblical leadership is working. Just use this as an exercise to get started on that, and just think, of examples. And also, as you're thinking of the negative examples, think of the examples of where people, have really kept this in mind as to whose church it is and what difference that makes in the ministry. And you might even, as again, part of the getting ready for your essay and your final, contrast the two. Say, okay, here's this group that I know, they really forgot whose church it was, and they thought it was theirs, and how that was run and the results that happened, as opposed to somebody you know of that is running it, or they know whose church it is. They realize that they are the under shepherd to the great shepherd, and how that church or ministry operates. Great way to just spend some time contemplating that. And finally, we get to the word church. We're actually going to spend a little bit more time on this one word than we have on the others. First, what is a church? Well, if we look at Greek, when it's referred to as in the English translation of church, we'll see the Greek ecclesia. It means the called out ones. We got the Hebrew and the Aramaic, kahal, which is invited gathering. In Greek, you might see synagoge, which is bringing together or assembly. That's where we get the word synagogue that we see now. It's still, if you look at a Jewish assembly, they meet at the synagogue. This verse was first seen during the diaspora, when the people were spread out after they were driven out of the land. They didn't have the temple. So they would get these assemblies, and they started calling them their synagogues. And then that just, as they were spread out further and further, and didn't have just the temple to get to for all their important things, then it developed more into the synagogue system that we still see today among Jewish congregations. And, they just started meeting wherever they could meet sometimes. Okay, the church. It's not a building. Kind of look at the history, go way back to the beginning. During the Exodus, they had the tabernacle, which was portable. A portable church. Kind of sounds familiar, doesn't it? Motel church. Most of the stuff we're either, getting it from a storage facility or bringing it in our cars. It's portable. Kind of back. So we still have things like that today. Then once they were settled in the land, they built the temple finally. Then, as we talked about, when they were spread out and forced to be away from the area, then they had their synagogues. We see that some of the first Christian assemblies were in the temple courts. Then once that kind of got separated from the Jews, we started seeing more Gentiles, especially because they weren't allowed in the temple or in the temple courts. We started seeing that these new believers now were meeting in the houses of other believers. We even see, during Jesus' time, he would just meet in wherever there was a good spot. Someplace that maybe had good acoustics, Sermon on the Mount. He'd roll off onto a boat. There might be a hill behind him. It would make a great impromptu amphitheater. And such things were even used by the early church. They've even used some of like the Greek and Roman stadiums or amphitheaters when they had the opportunity, and maybe before they got kicked out by the local authorities. Again, any convenient meeting place, down by the river, might be a great place down there where everybody could assemble. Lots of different places. They, would even meet in the catacombs when they were under persecution. Nobody wanted to go down among all the dead there, but they was okay. That was a safe place to meet. Then we started seeing the advent more and more of church buildings. Got even into the construction of these big and ornate cathedrals. And at some point in time, it kind of seemed like things really became more about the building than about being the church. The church is not a building, like we said. It's also not a denomination. A lot of denominations seem to think, that they're the only true church. But it's not about a denomination. It's not a business. Definitely, it's not a political entity. Some people would like to create and think it is. But it's a spiritual entity. It's the body of believers who love Christ and are assembled in his name. That's what the church is. Continuing on to look at it, what's the purpose of a church? Carry on the work that Christ started, which is spread the good news and build up the believers. Obviously, you have to spread the good news. How are people going to know about it unless somebody tells them? And then once they've heard it and they've accepted this gift of salvation and forgiveness that Christ offers, then what happens? That's when you have to be there to help build them up in their belief. Be there when they have the doubts. You always need somebody who's one step ahead of you. Whether it's the new believers, you need somebody there. Whether you're the leader, you need somebody, one step ahead of you to help mentor. And of course, we all have Christ himself, who's way above and way ahead of all of us, and the one that we can look to for the mentoring and how we go about doing this. And it's basically to ensure the future generations are equipped to continue the work. Christ showed how to train the next generation of Christian leaders, and each generation has to maintain that, or the process dies. You think about it, at any one time, we're only one generation from this dying out. Now, it's sustained for 2,000 years, so that Christ has got a way that he's going to keep it going, even if we fail sometimes. He's got a plan. And he's going to keep it going because that was his promise, that it would last until he returned. So now we're going to start moving away from some of those definitions, and we're going to start looking at what happened in the early church. On Good Friday, Jesus laid himself down as the cornerstone of the church. Then on Easter, he rose as the head of the body of believers. Then you could say that on Pentecost, the church was born. Look at Acts 2:40-41. And with many other words, he, that being Peter, testified and exhorted them, saying, "Be saved from this perverse generation." Then those gladly received his words were baptized, and that day about 3,000 souls were added to them. Jesus had trained this group that were now taking over. He encouraged them. He provided field studies. He sent them off, on little missions as while he was still here, and came back and would go through the debriefing on that. Say, okay, this is what went well. This is what didn't so well. This is how you handle it. Let's go out and do it one more time and see what's going on. Then he commissioned them, as we saw right at the beginning of this study with the Great Commission. He commissioned his apostles and the disciples that were following him. And then he turned them loose to spread what he had started to the world. So what's required to be a member of the church? Basically right now, each church or denomination, religion, they've got their membership requirements, most of which are man-made requirements. But what are the basic requirements to be a member of the church? Well, you have to hear the good news. You got to believe Jesus is who he says he is. And you have to receive his gift of salvation. Those are the basic requirements to be part of the church. Pretty much anything beyond that is going to be a man-made requirement. Look at the early church, we can see some of the essential elements that started showing up right as they were really getting started with this whole thing of how to now go about spreading the news and the work that Jesus had started. You see there's teaching, fellowship, breaking of bread, and prayers. Acts 2:42 says, "And they continued steadfast in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship, in the breaking of bread, and in prayers." That's where that basic list comes from. So we look at each of these elements individually, starting with teaching. So what was the early church teaching and preaching? They were teaching the apostles' doctrine and the Bible. They had what we were calling the Old Testament. Now, when we look at how they went about going to do this, it depended on, of course, where they were doing and who their audience was. If you look at Paul's journeys, he often would go to the synagogues first to start when he would get into a new area. Okay, in that case, he'd be speaking mostly to a Jewish audience. The Jews, of course, would be familiar with what we call the Old Testament. And so he would have a little bit easier task there because they've got something common to build on. When speaking to the Gentiles, though, they don't have that background. So you have to bring them up to speed. So there's a different level of teaching depending on who the early church's members were. Whether you could start assuming they have a certain basic knowledge of what's been written, in what we call the Old Testament, or if you have to basically bring them up with the whole history of how this goes. So when you say, how Jesus fulfilled this prophecy, they know what you're talking about. They had the teachings, of Jesus that were recalled, by those who were actually there, under the guidance of the apostles. This is now how, we get these eyewitnesses going out and spreading the good news and saying, okay, this is what Jesus said. This is what he did. These are the things going on. And in your New Testament survey course right now, you're looking at how all this knowledge of the apostles and these disciples, how they were being spread, how they were being recorded, how it started to, eventually forming into what we now call the New Testament, and how all this was. So this early church study really ties in real well with the New Testament survey. That's the other class you're working on right now, as we can see how this early church now was out spreading the word, how things were getting recorded, and the procedures were coming down. Look at fellowship. Again, going back to the Greek, it's koinonia, which means close mutual relationships. Now, the word koinonia is not something that's specific just to church. Koinonia was used in the Greek culture to be just about anything where there was some sort of a close mutual relationship. A lot of times it was with something more like a trade union. We see that in like the silversmiths or things like that, where they would have their own group mutual thing, and they would meet together and discuss whatever they had mutually. So that's kind of where it came about, is we're sharing mutual things in common and staying involved with each other. And it's also, living out what we learn from the teaching and preaching in the community. Essentially, putting what we learn into practice. At the breaking of bread. That's the ordinances. We got baptism and the Lord's table. They were actually doing things, more than just having, what we consider now as, the basic communion. A lot of times they were sharing full meals, and then making, of course, part of this would be the breaking of the bread and the reenacting what was going on at the Last Supper. But you also might recall, if you've been reading some certain sections of the Bible, that, sometimes this got out of hand, and people were getting a little bit gluttonous about this and turning it more into more about the food and the feast than it was about remembering what Christ had done. So that's something that one has to worry about. You might even say, breaking of bread, was that actually, the start of the church potluck, the way these guys were having, their meals together and etc. Who knows? But another aspect of it, of course, is worship. Anytime you're doing something to remember what Christ did and you're praising him and giving him glory, you're worshiping. And so worship is also a part of this. And prayer is another essential element. You've got several different types of prayer you might find. You've got your corporate prayer, which is more your congregational prayers, where you've got the leader up there, whether it be the senior pastor or one of the assistants or whoever is leading the congregation or the assembled group, whether it's, maybe it's not the church service, it's a ministry of some kind. And you got somebody that are leading, and it's a large assembly. Another thing you might have, of course, is individual prayer. And this, as part of the leadership, you help members develop their prayer life and how they'll go about communicating with God. Then you've got the intercessional prayers, which are prayers for others. It could be anything, praying for healing, praying for, their finances, praying for them in a sticky situation in their relationships, however it might be. You intercede. I mean, we see that throughout the history of prayer in the Bible. And of course, this is all modeled on how Jesus taught us to pray. So you can go back and as you're reading the Bible, you see where Jesus is praying or where any of the leaders are praying. See how they went about it and see where it fits. Was it a corporate prayer? Was it individual? Was it intercessional? Just pay a little more attention and see, look at this and see how it's structured and see if how they go about it. And summarizing, we have to look, that basically any programs, ministries, groups, or other activities, that a church does, it has to be there to support the essential elements required for a church under the definition that Jesus gave for his church. We gotta watch out. Sometimes we get some of these programs or various activities, and they're not necessarily there for the support of the essentials. Somehow, basically, it has to somehow tie in. Otherwise, you're kind of diverting attention from the important things that Jesus said, this is what my church is supposed to be. How do we do this? Of course, we're guided by the Holy Spirit. Goes back again to prayer, as we're contemplating, how do we go about doing this? How should we lead? Is this program or is this activity something that should be going? Take it to prayer. Take it in prayer. Say, Jesus, hey, I got this idea. Does this fit with what you want your church to be doing? And basically, if a church is healthy, it's going to grow. You don't really need to have a lot of these growth campaigns and whatever. If the church is healthy, it's going to grow. If it's not growing, it's not healthy. Good way to look at things. And if it's not, your church isn't growing, or your ministry, or whatever you're involved in, where you're being a leader in a biblical context. If it's growing, then you know it's healthy. If it's not, it might be worth stopping and taking a look and seeing what might be causing this. Because basically, we are sharing the good news. It's great news that we've got to share. And if we're doing it, and we're getting out there, and it's getting to the people, why wouldn't they be coming and joining and growing, and the church growing? If we're really doing what the church is supposed to do, which is to continue the work that Jesus started, you'd have to nail the doors of your church shut in order to keep it from growing. The good news and the Holy Spirit are that powerful that there's nothing that's going to stand against them. And we get the privilege of being part of that. We've been chosen to be leaders in some form or another. And that's what we have to do, is just do it exactly as Jesus said. Remember, it's his church. We're just helping him, being the hands, the feet, and occasionally letting him use our voice. And that's one of the things we're going to look at in the next session, is how to actually put all this into application. See you then.